Now, today's daf is daf Pei Zayin, and we'll start with the last two lines on Pei Vavam and Beis. Itmar, Pershu Kodem Chatzos. The Gemara is now going to introduce a machlokes between Rabbah and Rav Chizda. And we're talking about the Evarim that have to be burnt on the Mizbeach, and at some point in the process of burning, they became hard, and they were taken off the Mizbeach before Chatzos. And the machlokas now between Rabbah and Rav Yosef addresses the question of putting these Evarim back onto the Mizbeach after Chatzos. And the issue is whether Chatzos creates Ikul. Ayin Yud Chaf Vav Lamed, Ikul. So Rabbah Omar, and here we start off Pei Zayin, Chatzos Sheni Ochaltam. There's no Ikul here at the moment of Chatzos because you had removed the Evarim from the Mizbeach. So this halacha that Chatzos generates Ikul and makes it considered as if it was me'ukal, it was completely consumed, that only applies if the Evarim are on the Mizbeach at Chatzos. But in this case, you missed the boat, so to speak, and Chatzos came around, and the Evarim are nowhere to be found. They're not on the Mizbeach. And therefore, we have to wait for another Chatzos, the second night, in order to create Ikul. Now, once it's Ikul, then it's called Nases Mitzvaso, and the mitzvah of Haktoras Haimurim has completed itself. And therefore, there will be no Me'ilah, for example, if somebody misappropriates it, because it's already Nases Mitzvaso, the mitzvah is completed. But that's going to happen, according to Rabbah, only after the second Chatzos. Rav Chizda Omar, Amud HaShachar Ochaltam. In other words, according to Rav Chizda, although it's true that Chatzos generates Ikul, and therefore it's Nases Mitzvah, so without any Me'ilah, however, if you miss the boat on Chatzos, there's another time period that generates Ikul and makes it considered as if the Evarim were consumed, and that's Amud HaShachar, daybreak of the next morning. So the machlokas is going to be, if the Evarim were removed from the Mizbeach before Chatzos, at what point do we say that there's Ikul? According to Rabbah, with the second Chatzos, we have to wait a full 24 hours, where according to Rav Chizda, we only have to wait, let's say, 12 hours until daybreak. Amri Bei Rav, in the Beis Medrash of Rav, they said, my timer to Rav Chizda. What's the logic of Rav Chizda? In other words, why does Rav Chizda say that just like Chatzos creates Ikul, so too Amud HaShachar creates Ikul? And the Gemara offers a Kal V'chomer. Uma Chatzos she'ena osa lina osa Ikul, Amud HaShachar she'osa lina eno din she'osa Ikul. What's lina? Lina means when those Evarim and Pidarim that have to be burnt on the Mizbeach were left on the ground of the Azara, and they went through the entire night without being brought on the Mizbeach. With daybreak, they become lina. Lina means posel, and you cannot put them on the Mizbeach because it's already had a linas laila. So linas laila means when these designated parts of the carbon were not brought up during the course of the entire night, they become possible with daybreak. Up until daybreak, you have the entire night, which is appropriate for burning it on the Mizbeach. But once daybreak, it's too late, and it becomes possible midin lina. That's called linas laila. So we see that Amud HaShachar has the power to generate lina, because once the Avarim are left on the Ritzpas HaZorah up until Amud HaShachar, with Amud HaShachar, they become Pasul Midin Lina. Chatzos doesn't have the power to create lina, because as we said before, you could bring this on the Mizbeach during the course of the entire night. So certainly, if Chatzos cannot create lina, but nevertheless it create equal, we see that Amud HaShachar is even more powerful than Chatzos, because whereas Chatzos could not create lina, Amud HaShachar does create lina. Then if Chatzos creates equal, then how much more so would Amud HaShachar create equal? Now the Gemara takes the Machlokes Shin Rabbah and Rav Chizda and applies it to a different case. Pirshu kodem Chatzos v'chziron li'achar Amud HaShachar. Instead of replacing the Avarim onto the Mizbeach after Chatzos, they waited until after Amud HaShachar. Is Rabbah Omar Chatzos Sheni Ochalton? Rabbah says, okay, you missed the boat on the first Chatzos because you did not replace the Avarim onto the Mizbeach after Chatzos, but rather you waited until Amud HaShachar, but it doesn't matter. Rabbah says we have the second Chatzos, and the next Chatzos, the following Chatzos, will generate equal on the Mizbeach. Rav Chizda says, no, ein bahem equal li'olam. This entire process of creating equal would never come to pass. Now, what that means is that there's no nasis mitzvaso, and the Iser Me'ilah will continue forevermore until you could take these Avarim and make them into Pecham. Pecham means ashes. According to everybody, there's no issue about it that once the Avarim are physically consumed and there's nothing left to them, they were completely burnt up, and they became ashes, which is called Afer, then at that point, it's not royal for anything. It doesn't have any status lemizbeach at all, and therefore the Isur Me'ilu would be removed. But one thing the Gemara points out here is that both Rabbah and Rav Chizda agree that once the Avarim came off the Mizbeach before Chatzos, there's no din of equal with Chatzos. Why? Because the Avarim are now on the Ritzpas HaZorah, they're not on top of the Mizbeach. So if they're not on top of the Mizbeach, then there's no din of Chatzos creating equal. Maskif lo Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef is going to disagree with the very underlying premise, which was agreed upon by both Rabbah and Rav Chizda. Uman Lemelam, who told them, meaning Rabbah and Rav Chizda, the Chatzos b'rosh mizbeach mashvilei equal, that the only way that Chatzos could generate equal is if the Avarim are on top of the Mizbeach, Dilma perhaps, Kol Heichad Mishkachas Lo Mashvilei equal, wherever the Avarim are on the face of the earth, even if they're on the Ritzpah, nevertheless Chatzos generates equal. And in fact, this opinion of Rav Yosef was the accepted opinion. And the Gemara is now going to have to go back to the drawing board to explain Rabbah and Rav Yosef. Shalchu misam, they got a ruling from Eretz Yisrael, Hilchos Rav Yosef. Now, Tosfos points out that don't take those words literally, Hilchos Rav Yosef, which means we paskin halacha, because since the Beis Hamikdash unfortunately is destroyed and we don't have karbanos, then we don't paskin halachos as far as the Beis Hamikdash is concerned. But Hilchos Rav Yosef means that Rav Yosef's logic is acceptable, it's outstanding. And if we were to paskin halacha, then we would accept the logic of Rav Yosef, which means that again, chatzos generates equal on the Evarim, even if they're not on the Mizbeach. And Itmar Nami Omer Abchia Bar Abba. We have another statement that confirms Rav Yosef, and that is from Rab Chia Bar Abba, who says, Pirshu Kodem Chatzos, V'chziron Achar Chatzos. So it means that when Chatzos came, at that moment, the Evarim were not on the Mizbeach. And nevertheless, Rav Chia Bar Abba says, Lo nenim v'lo molim. Let's leave out the words lo nenim. We'll come back to that in a minute. That's a little bit more complicated. But the key of keys is v'lo molim, meaning there's no me'ilah. And why is there no me'ilah? Because there is equal. And equal generates nases mitzvaso and removes me'ilah. How does equal generate nases mitzvaso? I'm sorry, let's say it differently. How does chatzos generate equal when it's not al gabi mizbeach? So we see clearly that Rav Chia Bar Abba agrees to Rav Yosef's premise that the principle is that chatzos generates equal, removes the Isur Me'ilah through the process of Nasis Mitzvah, so even if the Eivar were not al Gabi Mizbeach. V'chein Tana Bar Kapar. Now, as far as Lo Nenim is concerned, there's machlokas here between Rashi and Tosfos as to whether or not this Isur Hana is D'Rabbanan. And Tosfos wants to assume that this Isur is an Isur Doraisa. V'chein Tana Bar Kapara. Now we have a third source to support the opinion and the logic of Rav Yosef, and that's a brisa of Bar Kapar. Pirshu kodem chatzos l'gzim li'achatzos yotze midei me'ilah. There's no me'ilah. Why? Because chatzos creates equal, even though he only put them back on the mizbeach after chatzos. Amalei Rav Papa Abaye v'chi bi'achad sholchu b'sam hilchos Rav Yosef v'amri lo. Rabbi Bar Chia Tana Bar Kapar. We have all these opinions that agree that there is equal with chatzos, even if it's not on the mizbeach. Is Rabba Rav Chisda b'may pligi? What are we going to do with the machlokas between Rabba and Rav Chisda? They both agree that chatzos would not generate equal because the Evarim are outside the mizbeach. Amalei b'shmeinim. We could talk about equal in a sense as like a natural process with the passage of time, except in the case of shmeinim. Shmeinim means where the Evarim are very fatty, and if they're fatty, then even though time has passed, there's no equal. Because equal means it's on its way to become afer, become ashes. But if it's very fatty, it won't become ashes. Boy, mine Rabba mi Rabba. Rava asked Rabba the following question: Lina mo elis berosha shel mizbeach, o ena mo elis berosha shel mizbeach. So now we're getting into the details about the psul of Lina, which means that the Evarim were left overnight until daybreak of the next morning without being burnt on the mizbeach. What happens if the process of burning the Evarim had begun, it didn't consummate? In other words, the Evarim were brought on top of the Mizbeach during the course of the night, but they weren't burnt. So do we say that the Psul Lina applies even though the Evarim were, in a sense, on their way to becoming burnt, meaning the process of the Avoda of Haktoras HaEmurim was so advanced that the Evarim were already on the Mizbeach? Maybe that itself is enough to preclude the Psul of Lina. Now we'll soon see that this issue really hinges on the question of whether Mizbeach has the same status as the Shulchan. Because we're going to see soon that in the case of Lechem Aponim and the Bezichin that accompanied the Lechem Aponim, even though they were left past that time period, but they were left on the Shulchan itself prevents the Psul of Lina. And the Gemara wants to know now whether Mizbeach has the same status as Shulchan, but we'll see that in just a minute. Hechidan, first of all, let's understand when Rava asked this question, what was the case? If we're talking about a case where the Evarim were on top of the Mizbeach and they never took them down from the Mizbeach, then the answer to Rava's inquiry is obvious. Because what's the halacha, even if there is a psul, if it was put on the Mizbeach, then you burn it. And that's called him Olu Lo Yeredu. Hashta, now there's a Kal V'chomer. Lanu Bazora Amrit Lo Yeredu. If there was a classic situation of the psul of Lina, where the Evarim were left outside the Mizbeach on the Ritzvas HaZorah, then you if they were brought up to the Mizbeach, which they shouldn't have been because they were disqualified, but if they were, then you burn it on the Mizbeach. You don't take it down. Is Barosha Mizbeach Mibai? Here's a case where the Evarim were on the Rosh of the Mizbeach the entire time during the night. Then for sure you would have to burn them. Because even if they were taken off the Mizbeach, you would have to put them back on the Mizbeach. I'm sorry. Even if they were taken off the Mizbeach and somebody put them back on the Mizbeach, you would burn them. How much more so if they were never taken off the Mizbeach? So that can't be the issue. Now, there's a long discussion here about the words Rosho Shel Mizbeach. There are many different parts to the Mizbeach, but Rosho Shel Mizbeach means on the top half of the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach is divided into two, with the Chud HaSikra in the middle, and we're talking about the top part of the Mizbeach. Ella, so what's the case that Rava was inquiring about? The Yardu, that the Evarim were taken down from the Azara. I'm sorry, from the Mizbeach. Now, where were the Evarim during the course of the entire night? They were on top of the Mizbeach. Then, after daybreak, after Amud HaShachar, they were taken down from the Mizbeach. Now the question is, do we put them back up onto the Mizbeach? Because normally the principle is, Im Yardu Lo Yalu. That if you have something that's disqualified for the Mizbeach, and it was taken off the Mizbeach, we don't put it back on the Mizbeach. So the only way we can understand Rava's inquiry is if we assume that there's a possibility, Rava vacillates about this, that Ein Lina B'Rosh Shel Mizbeach, and therefore there's no psul of Lina, and therefore if it was taken down after Amud HaShachar, we would put it back on to burn it, because there's no psul of Lina. What was Rava's suffix? L'shulchan medabinin lei. Oh, Dilma, I'm skipping a few words for a second. L'karka medabinin lei. Should we equate Mizbeach with Shulchan? Disnan, because we have a Mishnah in Masechta Menachos, Daf Kuf, Afilu hein ala Shulchan yomim rabim ein bekach klu. Let's say, for example, instead of placing the lechem aponim on the Shulchan on Shabbos, which was the normal Seder, then it was taken down the next Shabbos. Mistakenly, for whatever reason, they put the lechem aponim on Sunday. Now, the lechem aponim have to be on the Shulchan for a full 7 days. But if he put it on Sunday, then come the next Shabbos, he didn't have a full 7 days of lechem aponim on Gabi HaShulchan. So the Mishnah says it doesn't matter. And you might think now it should become possible because Shabbos came and you can't take the lechem aponim and the bezichah off the mizbeach. But the answer is no. As long as it's on the shulchan, then the Shulchan prevents any sort of disqualification. And if we'll wait till next Shabbos, we'll take it off the following Shabbos. So it'll be 13 days on the Shulchan. Now, if we assume that Shulchan has this power to prevent any kind of psul of lina and so forth, because the Shulchan is a klishares, which generates kedusha, then perhaps we should see the Mizbeach also as a klishares. Now, despite the fact that the Mizbeach is attached to the ground, but we see it as a separate entity, or shall we assume that the Mizbeach does not have a status of a klishares? A klishares has to be movable, and it's detached from the ground, whereas the Mizbeach is attached to the ground, and therefore it's part of the ground. It's like the Ritzbas HaZorah. And if it's the Ritzbas HaZorah, then there will be a psul of lina. And then when he wants to put it back on the Mizbeach after Amud HaShachar, he can't do so. Amalei ein lina barosh shel Mizbeach. So Rabba's response was that there's no psul of lina. We should accept the analogy between Mizbeach and Shulchan, and therefore there's no psul of lina. And after Amud HaShachar, he'll be putting it back onto the Mizbeach to burn it. Gemara wants to know, Kibla Minei Olo, did Rava accept that response? Rava himself was vacillating about this. He got an answer from Rabbah. Did he accept Rabbah's answer? Toshma, I'm going to prove to you that Rava never accepted Rabbah's opinion. Meaning, Rava insisted that the Mizbeach is not like the Shulchan, and there is lina al gabi Mizbeach. Toshma de Itmar, a varb shalonu ba'azara. So, in other words, with nightfall, he didn't put the Avarim onto the Mizbeach, left them on the Karka Azara, but Mekatev Holikolail, he has the entire night until daybreak to put the Avarim onto Mizbeach and burn them. Lan Barosha Shel Mizbeach, if on the other hand, he brought the Avarim onto the Mizbeach, but he didn't burn them, and they went through the entire night without the Aktar, without burning them. Is Makater v'holech li'olam. He can burn it indefinitely. In other words, even though we assume that there was a psul of lina because the entire night passed and he didn't burn them, nevertheless, it's no different than any carbon that was possible and is on top of the Mizbeach, and halacha is im olu lo yardu, meaning we burn it because it's on the Mizbeach, becomes lachmo shel Mizbeach, lachmo shel. Then the Brisa says, yardu, this is not a Brisa, I'm sorry, yardu, if after Amud HaShachar, he took the Avarim, instead of burning them on the Mizbeach, and he took them out of the Mizbeach, Rabba Omar Yalu. Rabba holds that there was no psul of lina on the Mizbeach, and therefore he just brings them up and burns them on the Mizbeach, but Rav Omar Lo Yalu. So we see clearly that Rava holds there is a psul of lina al gabi al rosh HaMizbeach, and we don't accept the equation to Shulchan, Shmamino Lo Kibla Minei Shmamino. We see that Rava did not accept Rava's opinion. Now the Mishnah says that the kevesh, which is the ramp on the side of the Mizbeach that leads up to the top of the Mizbeach, is kshem shemizbeach makadesh. The Mizbeach and the kevesh have the same status, and not only that, a klisharis is makadesh. And the Gemara says, how do we know this? Tana Rabbanan, we learned to the Bryce, Hanogeb Mizbeach. Right, the Torah says in Shmos Perkov Tes that Hanogeh b'mizbeach. So that means that if a psul korban that was disqualified came onto the mizbeach, then lo yerdu, you burn it. Ainli el mizbeach kevesh minayin. How do we know that even the kevesh has the capacity to be makadesh, a korban that's possible for the sake of burning it on the mizbeach? Talmud lomar es hamizbeach. We have a principle that whenever the Torah adds the word es, it's a ribui, and it's coming to include the kevesh. Kli sharis minayin. Talmud lomar kol anogeh bahem yikdash. The extra word kol is coming to include even a kli sharis. Boy minei Reish Lakish mi Rabbi Yochanan. Now Reish Lakish is going to ask a question to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is going to misunderstand Reish Lakish's question, and he's going to say, "What kind of question is that? It's explicit in the Mishnah." Klisharos ma'ashi kadish esapsul probably to nisua kshem shemizbev hakevish mekadosh tzaroi lehem kach kelim mekadshim. So the Mishnah says explicitly that the klisharis has the same power as the mizbech and the kevesh to be mekadesh korban pasul, and therefore olu lo yerdu, and we burn it on the mizbech. Amalei, so Yishak says, no, Rabbi Yochanan, you misunderstood my question. L'chatchil likariv kami boile. What I wanted to know, says Reish Lakish, is whether or not l'chatchila I'm allowed to put it on top of the mizbech. Meaning, we have a principle called im olu lo yerdu because the mizbech is makadesh, and that applies equally to the kevesh and to the klisharis. But that's if they're already on the mizbech. We don't take them down from the mizbech. Olachatchila, we are allowed to put them onto mizbech based on the kiddush of a klisharis. Hanami tunina, and Rabbi Yochanan says that question is also addressed in the Mishnah.